my thing is this. These record labels are inclined to keep us as dumb as possible. They know that if we get to communicating and putting our heads together and comparing notes, that we're going to figure out some shit real fast. They also know that if we get on the same page, it's a chance that we could unionize. They really don't want that.
This is an email from investment banker Jess Staley to Jeffrey Epstein in February 2014. And it says, the group that should be in the streets has been bought off by Jay-Z. The group that should be in the streets has been bought off by Jay-Z.
Pimp C, what happened to him?
He died on Mr. Carter's birthday.
Beyonce just did the halftime performance, and the license plate on that Cadillac was
Pimp C.
Thank you.
Sacrifice.
What if one of the most outspoken voices in hip-hop didn't just die young, but actually knew too much? Because when you connect the dots between Pimpy, Jay-Z, the music industry, and all these old interviews resurfacing right now, the story starts to feel a lot heavier than just rap beef or industry politics. We're talking about claims, leaked emails, old footage, and resurfaced interviews all crashing back into the conversation at the same time, and people online are starting to ask questions that nobody really wanted to touch for years. Pimpy wasn't just another rapper. He was one of the few who openly spoke about artists being controlled, divided, and kept from organizing power in the industry. He talked about unions. He talked about record labels keeping rappers separated. And at the time, a lot of people dismissed it as frustration or conspiracy talk. But now, those same ideas are being re-examined through a completely different lens. Especially with Jay-Z's name being pulled into controversial discussions again, and old industry emails resurfacing that allegedly describe how culture and influence are used at the highest level. Suddenly, Pimpy's old warnings don't sound so random anymore. They sound like early signals nobody fully understood at the time. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Was Pimpy just speaking his truth, or was he saying things that made him dangerous to the system he was talking about? Because once you understand what he said, how he moved, and how he viewed people in power, his story doesn't just look like history anymore. It looks like a warning that never stopped echoing. The deeper you go into Pimpy's interviews and old statements, the more his perspective starts to sound less like random frustration and more like someone who was observing patterns nobody else wanted to acknowledge out loud. After the hook, what stands out immediately is that Pimpy wasn't just talking about rap beefs or personal issues. He was talking about structure, control, and power dynamics inside the music industry. From his point of view, record labels weren't just businesses trying to make profit. He believed they were systems designed to manage artists in a way that kept them dependent, divided, and easy to control. And that idea, whether people agree with it or not, is what makes his words resurface so heavily today. He often emphasized that communication between artists was the biggest threat to that system. Not violence, not competition, but unity. Because once artists start comparing contracts, sharing experiences, and understanding how deals actually work behind the scenes, the illusion of fairness starts breaking down very quickly. That's why his repeated message about unionization became such a central part of his interviews. In his view, if rappers ever came together like athletes or actors did, the entire structure of the industry would change. Contracts would be questioned. Ownership would be demanded. And power would shift away from executives toward the artists themselves. But that kind of shift doesn't happen easily in any industry. And that's where Pimpy believed the resistance came in. He often described the industry as being built on competition between artists who, in reality, shared similar struggles. Instead of collaboration, he saw constant comparison. Instead of unity, he saw strategic separation. And instead of shared leverage, he saw individuals being positioned against each other for attention, sales, and influence. This is the foundation of why his interviews still circulate today. Because whether someone agrees with his conclusions or not, the structure he described is something people can recognize in multiple eras of music. Now, when people connect Pimpy to Jay-Z in these discussions, it's usually not based on one single statement. It's based on a combination of history, collaboration, disagreement, and interpretation of how the industry evolved during that era. One of the most commonly referenced points is their collaboration on Big Pimpin' Dot. On the surface, it was a successful record that helped bridge Southern and mainstream hip-hop sounds at the time. But behind the scenes, the process wasn't as smooth as fans might assume. Reports and interviews from people close to UGK suggest Pimpy wasn't initially comfortable with the direction of the track. The beat, the style, and the commercial tone didn't match what he wanted to represent artistically. He reportedly felt it leaned too far into mainstream appeal, which raised concerns about how UGK would be perceived moving forward. But eventually, he agreed to participate, with conditions. He didn't fully compromise his stance, but he also didn't fully reject the opportunity either. That tension between artistic integrity and industry opportunity is something many artists face, and Pimpy's decision became part of his legacy story. What makes this even more discussed today is how fans interpret that moment in hindsight. Some see it as Pimpy adapting to the industry. Others see it as the industry absorbing him temporarily without fully aligning with his beliefs. And that's where interpretation starts to split. Because once you attach ideology to collaboration, every action starts being analyzed through a deeper lens. Another major point that keeps resurfacing is Pimpy's loyalty to Tupac's mindset and principles. Whether or not he personally knew Tupac well, he respected what Tupac represented in terms of independence, resistance, and authenticity in the industry. That influence reportedly affected how he viewed collaborations and business decisions. In multiple stories shared by people around him, Pimpy was hesitant to work with artists or entities he felt were aligned with systems he didn't trust or respect. That belief system shaped a lot of his decisions. And it also contributed to why some of his choices in collaborations were selective or conditional. But here's where the modern conversation becomes more complicated. When people revisit Pimpy's old interviews today, they are not just watching them as entertainment. They're comparing them to current narratives about the industry, ownership, contracts, and influence. And that comparison naturally creates speculation, whether it is grounded in fact or not. This is where things become sensitive, because once interpretation enters the picture, people start connecting unrelated dots. Old interviews get reframed. Old collaborations get reanalyzed. And unrelated events start getting grouped together under broader theories. One of the most controversial parts of the discussion is how Pimpy's death is sometimes pulled into these narratives. Officially, his death in 2007 was attributed to health-related complications involving substances and sleep apnea. However, over time, alternative theories and speculation emerged online, especially as his old statements gained new attention years later. But it's important to separate what is documented from what is interpreted. There is no verified evidence that connects his passing to the theories circulating online. However, the reason these conversations continue to resurface is because Pimpy himself was a figure who openly challenged how the industry operates, which naturally leads people to re-examine his legacy through a more skeptical lens. And that's where perception becomes powerful. Because once someone is seen as a truth-teller in any system, everything that happens to them afterward tends to get reinterpreted through that identity. Meanwhile, Jay-Z's name enters this conversation not because of a single direct conflict, but because of his position in the industry over time. As someone who transitioned from artist to executive-level influence, he naturally becomes part of broader discussions about power, control, and structure in music business narratives. And that's where public discourse often blends fact, interpretation, and speculation together. Some discussions focus on his business success. Others focus on because what Pimpy represented was not just a conflict with one person or one label, it was a mindset that questioned the entire structure. And that is why his interviews continue to circulate even today. Not necessarily because everything he said was proven or agreed upon, but because he asked questions that still don't have simple answers. As the rumors, interviews, and resurfaced clips continue spreading across social media, one thing becomes clear very quickly: this isn't just another rap industry discussion anymore. It has turned into a full-blown debate about legacy, power, influence, and how much of what we see in hip-hop is real versus carefully controlled narrative. Because when people start connecting old interviews, leaked documents, and long-standing rumors, the story always grows bigger than the original moment it came from. And that's exactly what's happening here with Jay-Z, Pimp C, and the resurfaced conversations around industry control. Now, before going any further, it's important to separate what is confirmed from what is being claimed online. A lot of the current discussion is based on interpretations of old interviews, alleged emails, and fan theories that have been circulating for years. Nothing here is officially proven in the way social media often presents it, but the conversations themselves are what's driving attention. So the question people are asking is simple. Why do these discussions keep coming back, especially when Pimp C's name is involved? To understand that, you have to go back to the early 2000s when UGK was rising and Southern rap was still fighting for respect in a New York-dominated industry. At that time, Pimp C was one of the most vocal artists challenging how record labels operated behind the scenes. He wasn't just talking about fame or beats, he was talking about ownership, contracts, and control. In multiple interviews over the years, Pimp C often expressed frustration with how artists were treated, suggesting that labels benefited from keeping artists divided and competitive rather than united. Whether people agreed with him or not, his message was consistent. Unity among artists could shift power away from executives and toward creators. That idea alone made him stand out in an era where most artists avoided speaking too openly about the business side of the industry. At the same time, Jay-Z was rising into a different position entirely. Not just as an artist, but as a businessman who would later become deeply involved in labels, streaming platforms, sports management, and major corporate partnerships. That evolution placed him in conversations about power in hip-hop, whether fair or not. And this is where narratives start to split. On one side, fans see Jay-Z as a symbol of success, someone who transitioned from artist to mogul. On the other side, critics and conspiracy-driven discussions online frame that same success as part of a larger system that benefits from controlling cultural influence. Pimp C's old interviews get pulled into that debate because he often spoke about the industry in a way that now feels predictive to some viewers, even though at the time he was simply expressing frustration with contracts and artist treatment. One of the most circulated ideas online is the claim that artists were being bought off or used as influence tools to distract from deeper issues in society. This interpretation comes from how people read between the lines of older interviews and a few controversial emails that have been shared across social media platforms. However, it's crucial to understand that many of these documents are taken out of context or discussed without full verification. They exist in a gray area where interpretation often replaces fact. Still, that hasn't stopped the conversation from growing. Because when you combine Pimp C's outspoken personality, his criticisms of the industry, and his untimely death in 2007, people naturally start looking for patterns, even when those patterns may not actually exist. Official. Reports at the time stated that Pimp C's death was related to health complications involving sleep and substance factors, but online discussions have long questioned those findings. Not necessarily with evidence, but with speculation fueled by timing, circumstance, and emotion. And this is where modern internet culture changes everything. In today's world, no story stays contained. Old interviews resurface. Clips get edited. Quotes get reinterpreted. And suddenly, a 15-year-old statement becomes part of a brand new theory. That's exactly what happened here. As Jay-Z's public image continued evolving through business deals, interviews, and cultural influence, any past criticism from artists like Pimp C started being revisited under a new lens. People began asking whether Pimp C was misunderstood or whether he saw something others didn't. At the same time, others argue that this is simply hindsight bias, where past comments are reshaped to fit current narratives. Because when you actually break it down, there is no verified evidence linking Jay-Z to the claims being circulated online about Pimp C's death or any coordinated industry targeting. What exists instead is a mixture of interviews, emotional reactions, and internet theories that continue to evolve over time. But perception is powerful. And in hip-hop culture especially, perception often becomes reality in the public eye faster than facts can catch up. That's why this topic refuses to die. Every few months, a new clip resurfaces. A new tweet goes viral. A new connection is made between old statements and current events. And each time, it reopens the same debate about power, control, and what really happens behind the scenes in the music industry. What makes it even more intense is the emotional weight attached to names like Pimp C and DMX, artists who are widely respected and whose deaths left a lasting impact on fans. When people feel that loss deeply, they naturally start questioning whether everything was purely coincidental or if there was something more. But even with all the speculation, one fact remains consistent. No official investigation or verified report has ever confirmed the deeper allegations being spread online. Still, the conversation continues because it isn't just about facts anymore. It's about belief, trust in systems, and how people interpret the rise and fall of influential figures in entertainment. And as long as those questions remain unanswered in the minds of fans, the debate around Jay-Z, Pimp C, and the industry will keep resurfacing in cycles, each time louder than before. And just as this conversation starts to reach its peak online, new claims, old interviews, and resurfaced theories begin to shift the narrative again, leading into an even deeper breakdown of how these stories continue to evolve in part 2. And as this discussion continues to spiral across platforms, the conversation stops being about one artist or one interview and starts turning into something much bigger: how narratives in hip-hop are built, repeated, and amplified over time until they feel like truth to large sections of the internet. Because once a theory gains enough traction, it doesn't need constant evidence to survive. It only needs repetition, emotion, and selective clips that support the story people already want to believe. That's exactly what keeps this entire topic alive years later. In this environment, old footage of Pimp C gets re-edited and reposted with new captions, new angles, and new interpretations. A single sentence from an interview can suddenly be framed as a warning. A random comment becomes proof. And a broader industry critique becomes personalized towards specific individuals, even when the original context never supported that conclusion. That's where distortion starts. What Pimp C actually represented in his time was a raw, unfiltered voice from the South at a moment when Southern hip-hop was still fighting for recognition and fair treatment. He spoke about contracts, artist exploitation, and lack of ownership in ways that were rare for mainstream artists back then. But those conversations were about the system as a whole, not targeted accusations towards specific figures in the way they are often framed today. As for Jay-Z, his career trajectory placed him in a very different position over time. From artist to executive to global business figure, his influence expanded far beyond music. And when someone becomes that visible, they naturally become a reference point for broader discussions about power in the industry, whether those discussions are fair or not. But influence alone is not evidence of wrongdoing. And this is where online discourse often blurs the line between criticism, interpretation, and assumption. Another major factor driving this entire conversation is how people process loss in hip-hop culture. When influential artists pass away, especially those who were outspoken or controversial, fans often revisit their words looking for hidden meanings. Interviews get rewatched. Lyrics get re-examined. Old conflicts get relitigated. It's not unusual. It's part of how fan culture works in the digital age. But the problem begins when interpretation replaces verified information. Once that happens, narratives can grow in directions completely disconnected from the original facts. In Pimp C's case, his outspoken personality makes him especially easy to mythologize. He didn't filter his opinions, he didn't avoid industry criticism, and he didn't follow the usual PR-safe approach most artists are encouraged to take. That authenticity is exactly why his words still circulate today, but it also makes it easier for those words to be taken out of context. Meanwhile, the allegations and claims that get attached to these discussions online are rarely supported by official documentation or credible investigation. Instead, they exist in the space between rumor, speculation, and selective memory. That doesn't stop them from spreading, though. Because the internet rewards emotional storytelling. And when a story involves fame, money, power, and tragedy, it spreads even faster. What gets lost in all of this is the actual complexity of the music industry itself. Record labels are businesses. Artists are contractors. Contracts are legal agreements. And conflicts, while real, usually involve money, control, and creative direction rather than the dramatic narratives often attached to them online. None of that is as simple or cinematic as internet theory suggests, but it is far more grounded in reality. At the same time, it's also true that artists throughout history have spoken about unfair treatment, lack of ownership, and exploitative contracts. Those conversations are valid and have led to real changes in how modern artists approach independence and ownership. So the real legacy of voices like